There is a story, and maybe you heard of it. I don't know. It was a small story. Very few news outlets picked it up. The headline being, Pope Francis allows priests to bless same-sex couples. Did you hear that story? Well, we're going to be talking about that. Now, the first thing that I want to cover is that there was a lot of consternation that people had over this story. I was receiving text messages. I was receiving, in my group chats that I'm in, people were in a frenzy. And I'm thinking of a number of group chats, not just one. And my dad even was getting text messages from his friends. And my dad, he's a fireman. He's not like involved in Catholic ministry at all. And his coworkers just know he's Catholic. And they're like, dude, what on earth is going on? And he had people who were Catholic reaching out to him. He goes, what is going on here? And it's concerning a lot of people. It's concerning a lot of people. Let me give you a couple examples. I had a friend reach out, said, my two nieces were visiting down from California because they know I'm a strong Catholic. They wanted to know the Pope's teaching on the blessing of same-sex marriages. I told them I'd get back to them. I did say he cannot change the doctrine of the church. Does this change the doctrine? I'm confused too. Someone else said, experiencing the same overload of family members and friends of the same-sex blessings, we need to pray. So many people confused and outraged. My phone is blowing up with so many of my family that's confused, and it's all over social media. I told my older kids to pray. So another one of my friends said, and this friend, he's actually, he was like, dude, I'm getting prepped for surgery. He's a medical student, and he was like, dude, I'm getting prepped for surgery. And he goes, is this real? What do we do? This is really bad, bro. I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I don't get it. Is the church the Catholic faithful? What is the church? This is the kind of world-rocking thing for me, but I don't have time to look into all this. If the leadership collapses, what is the church? How do you not fall into wrath when stuff like this happens? My gut reaction is hatred. And I received, that's just a few of the messages that I received yesterday. Just tons of messages from people who are freaking out about this. Ambiguity is not charitable. It is not charitable to be ambiguous. Clarity is charity. This is the thing that people keep saying, is that nothing changed, nothing happened, and it's no big deal. There's a lot of people out there, a lot of people who are saying that. And here's the reality. The reality is you can get into the document and we can go through the theology of it, and I'm happy to do so. Maybe we'll do that tomorrow. But for today, I want to talk about the perception of the document. Because right now, let me just tell you, the entire world, save that of maybe 5 people who are public figures, are saying that Pope Francis is accepting same-sex blessings. Let me give you an example. Just going through headlines. New York Times, Pope Francis allows priests to bless same-sex couples. The NPR, Pope Francis approves blessing for same-sex couples. CNN, Pope Francis authorizes blessings for same-sex couples. ABC, Al Jazeera, LA Times, The Guardian, PBS, Independent. It goes on and on and on. And here's the biggest thing. People are saying, these people are being irresponsible. This is not what it says. This is completely incorrect. Then why does Vatican News, the official news source of the Vatican, vaticannews.va, say, doctrinal declaration opens possibility to bless couples in irregular situations? Very interesting. Very interesting way to put that. Irregular situations. Why be so ambiguous about that? Why do that? Now, there is somebody that you probably are familiar with, and I've never been a fan of. I've talked about him in the past. Father James Martin, S.J. I actually agree with Father James Martin on this. Father James Martin came out and he said publicly on Twitter, he said, Vatican Declaration of Same-Sex Blessings, be wary of the, quote, nothing has changed response to today's news. It's a significant change. In short, yesterday as a priest, I was forbidden to bless same-sex couples at all. Today, with some limitations, I can. That's from Father James Martin, S.J. He's very notorious for pushing for homosexual blessings in the church. One of the outrageous things that he said was he looks forward to the time when two people of the same sex can kiss each other during the sign of peace. Yeah, that's Father James Martin. This is very concerning. Now, some people were saying, so they're talking about, okay, why was this document released? Okay, so here is the thing. You should always ask whenever things come up, unto what end? Unto what end? So what is the purpose of this? Why do this? And so the question is, unto what end? Why did they release this document? Now, some people are saying there is nothing happened. Everything is fine. The document says they do not approve of same-sex marriage. Well, they're right. It specifically says it has nothing to do with marriage. It's very clear in the document. It is not saying they're approving of same-sex marriage. It's very, very, very clear in the document. However, there's a lot of ambiguity. So what is the purpose of this document if it's not actually changing anything? If it's just saying what the church has said over and over again, then why release a document? Isn't that interesting? Because something has to be different, or it has to be emphasizing or responding to a crisis. Now, some have suggested that it's responding to the situation in Germany. Because today, or rather, I guess yesterday, 38 out of a total of 58 German bishops voted to approve blessing irregular unions, including homosexual. 11 bishops abstained and 9 bishops opposed. So some are saying that this is to combat the German bishops. I highly doubt that's the case, and I would be happy to be wrong, but this is how you'll know. Will there be any punishment to the German bishops? We'll find out over the coming days whether or not the German bishops will be punished. I have major doubts that that will in fact be the case. But if they do get punished, then you could say, okay, well, that was the purpose of the document, to not allow the German bishops to continue what they're doing. But if the German bishops are ignored, because remember, it's not like the Vatican is against punishing bishops. We see it with Bishop Strickland. We've seen it with Cardinal Burke. We've seen it with many of just regular priests who have been restricted by the Vatican. You think whether or not it's just or not just, it doesn't really matter. But we've seen them punish priests. You think of Father Pavone, for instance. He was removed from the priesthood, so he's not even Father Pavone anymore. He's just Mr. Pavone. And so whether or not that was just or not, let's just say that it's 100% fine, no big deal. But why not Father James Martin? Why not Father Rupnik? Why these priests and not others? It's very interesting. You can tell a lot about somebody by what they don't do. Because remember, you can sin by omission. You can sin by omission, by failing to do. That's why we pray for what I have done and what I have failed to do. See, if the blessings that we were giving were the blessings that you get at confession, when you kneel down before the priest and say, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," then there would be no problem. There would be no problem whatsoever. But this is not what is happening here. And some people are saying, okay, no, Adrian, this is not what's happening, and you're misinterpreting what's happening. This is not good. Well, here's the problem. We've seen many priests already publicly, and these are just the priests that are bold enough to say this publicly. How many priests are doing this who will not come out publicly and admit to this? But for instance, Father Satish Joseph said the Vatican directive that same-sex couples can be blessed, but without any type of ritualization or offering the impression of a marriage, is one way of balancing the pastoral care of LGBTQ Catholics and existing doctrine. At least the Pope is willing to address the issue. Father Kyle Hayden said, if anyone is interested, I'd be more than happy to bless same-sex unions. Father Patty said, I warmly welcome Pope Francis' pastoral support to same-sex couples seeking a blessing for their love and lives together. My experience of life is that the black and white legalism of the past has alienated, excluded, and left too many feeling rejected by the church. And then, of course, you have Father James Martin, who has the most, I would argue, clear statement on this situation. He said, the Vatican's new declaration, Fiduciae Supplicans, is a major step forward for the church's ministry to LGBTQ people and recognizes the deep desire in many Catholic same-sex couples for God's presence in their loving relationships. It is also a marked shift from the conclusion God does not and cannot bless sin from just 2 years ago. The declaration opens the door to non-liturgical blessings for same-sex couples, something that has been previously off limits for bishops, priests, and deacons. Along with many priests, I will now be delighted to bless my friends in same-sex unions. So there you go. So it doesn't actually matter whether or not the document says it or not. people are doing it. Priests and deacons and bishops are going to be doing this. So now the question is, will the Vatican punish these people? My guess is that they won't. And the worst part about this is that Cardinal Fernandez came out publicly and said he will not be issuing any further clarifications. So submit your dubia, ask your questions, voice your concerns. He will not respond. He's not going to clarify anything. So what does that mean? The truth of the matter is that we cannot bless sin. That's simply the case. I don't care who you are. I cannot accept that. I cannot accept that because the church is not the Pope. The Pope is not the church. And that goes back to what my friend was saying. My friend asked, okay, well then what is the church? Is the church the faithful? How can it be that the gates of hell have not prevailed against the church? Well, because the Pope is not the church. Yes, he is the head of the church, but the Pope is only infallible when he is infallible. He is only infallible in those circumstances, in very particular circumstances. In this situation, it's simply the case that what he's doing here is not right. He's not right. And if it is the case that he actually did not mean to allow for same-sex blessings, which we'll get in tomorrow, into the actual document itself, well, then he has an obligation before Almighty God to correct publicly and say, look, people are misinterpreting this. This is not what I meant. This is not the teaching of the church. But we can be affirmed in the fact and know that God wins in the end. Because I was asked, hey, Adrian, how do you not have hatred in your heart? Adrian, how are you not so upset? Adrian, how do you not lose hope? Well, it's very simple. One, I'm not surprised by this. I expected these things to happen. We've been seeing the trajectory, so I'm not surprised. And two, I know that in the end, Our Lady said her Immaculate Heart would triumph. I am confident. I pray for the virtues of calm, courage, and confidence. I'm calm because I know that these storms were predicted. Our Lady said that there would be tumult in the church. Our Lady of Akita said there would be times where there would be bishop against bishop, cardinal against cardinal. And here we are. So Our Lady predicted it. She told us it would happen, so we should not fret. We should have courage and recognize now is a time to be a faithful Catholic. Now is a time to fight for the church. Now is a time to be great saints, to know our faith, to learn it ourselves. And I have confidence. I have confidence in the promise of Our Lady and the promise of our Lord. So let us pray today. Let us pray that God send forth his mercy. We're going to talk about the blessings of same-sex peoples during from the article, the document that came out from the Vatican on Monday. So I want to start off here. Father James Martin, who many people know, and many people know I'm very critical of Father James Martin, and I'm still very critical of Father James Martin. But Father James Martin is, in fact, someone of influence. He is the second most followed Catholic on social media, second only to the Pope himself. He also holds a position under the communications branch of the Vatican. He also was a voting member of the Synod on Synodality. He also has received personal letters from Pope Francis, and he also has several meetings with the Holy Father. And so his opinion about these things seems to have some sway. And I actually agree with his take on what's happening here. So I want to play clip 2 for a second here. And here is him talking about in a podcast inside the Vatican about what exactly is his interpretation of what's happening with the new document.
I'm truly that in a pastoral setting, in a theological setting, something good is seen in same-sex relationships, right? In Pope Francis's comments, of course, which are more off the cuff, he talked about same-sex couples and LGBTQ people, but this is a pretty significant opening. They're basically saying there is something good here, and God can accompany people in these situations. And it permits priests and deacons and bishops, and I'm assuming, I'm not sure about this interpretation, but other lay leaders, right, Catholic pastoral associates, to do these things, to bless these couples freely, right? And one of the things I expected, if this document were to come out, it would say something like, well, this needs to be approved by local bishops' conferences, or the local bishop will decide this, right? Or the pastor. No, it leaves a lot of latitude up to the individual minister, which is also a surprise. I think that's kind of going unseen. This is pretty broad.
Yeah, so this is really interesting to see Father James Martin's comments on this, because I'm listening to it, and I've listened to the entire podcast. We'll play a little bit more for you in a minute, but I don't see really too many things where I would disagree with him on his interpretation of what the document is actually doing. Now, obviously, I think it's not good, and he thinks it is good, and that's the main difference between he and I. But his actual interpretation of what's happening is spot on. He posted a picture yesterday of himself blessing this homosexual couple where they're holding hands. And sure enough, people were in outrage saying, see, James Martin's already going off the handle. And I kept on asking people, what exactly in the picture you see violates the document? Can someone explain that to me? And nobody could explain why it was. They simply were outraged by the picture. And I'm saying, look, guys, I also don't think that he should be doing this. But according to the document itself, someone please explain to me how it is that he is wrong. So we're going to get into that next, because a lot of people are saying that nothing changed and there's nothing wrong. Everything is still hunky-dory. So we're going to get into the actual text of the document coming up in just one moment. Now, this document, all the headlines across the globe say Pope Francis approves of same-sex blessings. Is that the case? Well, I want to start here. And I told you yesterday we'd be very practical. Today we get into kind of more of the minutia. And I'm reading this book, Two Timely Issues, by Arnaldo de Silveira. And he wrote this book in 1969. It was published in 1970. And here's something he says, and I think it was very, very interesting. And we've read this passage a few months ago, but it's worth repeating. And this book, again, it's a pretty dense book theologically, but here's what the text says. It says, furthermore, considering the situation only in the abstract, it is not licit to forget that, at least until breaking with the church, heretics usually present their doctrine by alternating orthodox passages with confused, ambiguous, suspect, and heterodox ones. Accordingly, in the hypothesis being analyzed, in addition to losing much of their favorable significance, the Orthodox texts raise one more reason for grave suspicion. We desire to abstract from person and ponder the matter with all scientific rigor. Now, he goes on, and I highly recommend reading this book. It's excellent. He goes on to talk about the modus operandi, and then he gives examples throughout history of Arianism, Pelagianism, monotheism, Protestantism, Jansenism, modernism. And he goes through explaining how they act, how they kind of present their position, stating, I totally believe in the Orthodox position, 100%. And they spend this whole time espousing the Orthodox position, and then they give a bait and switch. And they say, actually, we don't believe in the Orthodox position. He says at the end of the section, he says, in summary, the preoccupation with disguising themselves is particularly acute among the progressivists, who know very well that the faithful would immediately repudiate them if they knew their real designs, thus affirming the traditional doctrine and then revitalizing it to the point of concluding the contrary of what was just said in a characteristic tactic of progressive neo-modernism. It was one of modernism. However, in addition to being a tactic, this way of proceeding expresses a basic element of neo-modernist metaphysics, or rather, it forms part of the dialectical, Hegelian, and pneumatological anti-metaphysics of neo-modernist. Now, that was a huge, ginormous jumble of jargon, which is not really important to get into that. So, the last thing I want to bring up here is an example. So here he brings up an example of what exactly he means. He says that he gives the example of Father Bernard Herring, who was a peritus, an expert, and he wrote a book on marriage in the modern world. And here he says, in the text of Father Herring, several contradictions appear. He said it's particularly significant that one of the first paragraphs, he declares, naturally, the church's principle remains firm that divorced persons whose first marriage was valid in the sight of God and their conscience have no right to remarry, and that a civil marriage is no true marriage. And then later on, he then starts to hedge that and starts to change his mind, and he contradicts himself. Why does he do that? Well, it's because he wants to be able to say whenever he has critics, oh, look, no. If you read the first paragraph, I clearly stated the Orthodox position. I clearly said marriage is indissoluble. Marriage is always there. Divorce is not an option. Oh, yeah, that other passage over there says something different, but you have to read that passage first. The reason why I bring this up, and this chapter was excellent in trying to understand the way this works, it's very, very good in that sense, is because you read paragraph 31 of this document, and then you read the rest of the document, and they are contradictory. Because the vast majority of the document is pretty much fine. It's pretty much A-okay. The majority of the document says, oh yeah, we affirm the teaching on marriage. Of course, this is a sin. Of course, the church would never change its teaching on this. But then you go to paragraph 31, and it says, within the horizon outlined here appears the possibility of blessings for couples in irregular situations and for couples of the same sex. This is very, very important because many, many people are saying, no, this is a blessing for individuals, not for couples. But I'm curious, how do you say that if you actually read the document? Because the document says in paragraph 31, quote, the possibility of blessings for couples in irregular situations and for couples of the same sex. That is a huge deal. This is a huge deal. Now, and then it has a comma, and then it goes on forward, and it says, the form of which should not be fixed ritually by ecclesiastical authorities to avoid producing confusion with the blessings proper to the sacrament of marriage. So it does this over and over again. It'll say something very, very heterodox, something that is like jaw-dropping, like, oh, how could you say that? And then it'll pivot and say, not to be confused with marriage. And it does this over and over again. It's a giant bait and switch, so that way the people will be able to come out and say, oh, no, you have to see, clearly he's saying that you can't do this. But it leaves a ginormous gaping hole in the wall for people like Father James Martin to drive through it. And I can't see why Father James Martin is wrong. So I want to play this clip of Father James Martin going through this document himself and explaining what he sees in it, and we'll play some of that clip for you.
Yeah, practically speaking, it means that priests, deacons, and bishops can, in certain circumstances, bless same-sex couples. Now that, as you said, doesn't mean that there is, same-sex marriage allowed in a sacramental way in the church. And it also means you can't do it in a way that may make it seem like it's a marriage, but it's a big step forward because, yesterday I couldn't bless same-sex couples publicly in any sort of setting. Now I can.
The thing about blessing same-sex couples is...
And that's a big deal, what he said there. The reason why that's a big deal is because Father James Martin is very, very clever. He is an intelligent man. By no stretch of the imagination is he a fool. Father James Martin has been very careful. This is why he's always able to say everywhere he goes, oh, I'm in good standing with my bishop. I'm in good standing with my community. Because he always toes the line and he walks on that line where he doesn't cross over to violating any laws so he can't be punished. And so he is always walking down the line. He will say outrageous things, which I think he should be punished for. Like saying, for instance, that he prays for the day when homosexuals can kiss each other during the sign of peace. And that's a obviously disgusting thing that he would say. But is there anything heretical in him expressing that opinion? Well, I would argue it's at least heteroprax, a bad practice. But it's not heterodox, and to just say it, he's very, very careful about what he says. Very, very careful. So the fact that he says, oh, yesterday I could not do this and today I can, means a lot, especially considering the reaction from many of the bishops, which maybe we'll be able to get into in just a second, but let's continue playing that clip.
Same-sex couples is only a small part of this, and it mostly even focuses on the question of blessings for people in what the Vatican calls irregular unions. So that's, divorced and remarried folks. That's people, as was often talked about in the Synod, in polygamous relationships. And then it could also.
And that blew my mind because I kept on asking myself, okay, what do they mean by irregular situations? What is a couple of irregular situation that would qualify in this category that are not same-sex couples? Because he makes a distinction: irregular situation couples and couples of the same sex. So one, they're saying that couples of the same sex are, one, not irregular because they don't fall under that category, and two, they're saying that this is a category of thing. And this woman who is the host of this of their podcast said that the Synod, they said that polygamous relationships are under the category of irregular situations. Now that is jaw-dropping. Okay, now maybe they mean polygamy in the sense that divorced and remarried is polygamy, because if you're divorced and remarried, you're still married to your first spouse, and so technically you're in a polygamous relationship. Maybe that's what they mean. I really hope they don't mean currently actively civilly married to multiple people at the same time, but I have no idea. The thing is, Father James Martin does not correct her, and he was on this committee. He was specifically on this committee, but let's continue listening to this.
So be same-sex couples. Can you talk me through this theology of blessings?
Yeah, so before in the response in 2021, the line that everybody remembers is God cannot and does not bless sin.
Right, which really hurt some people. We talked to folks on Inside the Vatican about that.
And in fact, Pope Francis was not too happy with it. And I was just looking it up. Removed from the CDF was Father Morandi, who apparently was the chief author of that. So there was a sense of Francis himself not liking the way that was framed. But it's clear there's now a turnabout. And what does it mean? Well,
how does this build on, or does it contradict?
Here's a big deal, because here he's talking about the document that came out in 2021 under Cardinal Ladaria. And whenever this came out, this was a huge thumbs up. There was a huge thumbs up. Everybody was like, see, the Vatican's not changing anything. Everything's hunky-dory. Everything's going great. And then this document comes out. And here's the trick. And this is why I read this Two Timely Issues first about what he says here, is because they say this is a development of that doctrine that was taught in 2021. It was said that this is a development of that. Almost all the footnotes in there are quoting Pope Francis himself in his documents. But the 2021 statement says the blessings be of an individual person and not a relationship. That's what it said in 2021. It also said when two people are blessed together, the relationship or partnership is blessed along with the persons. This is why it can only be a blessing of one person. The emphasis on the plan of God as defined in this document is specifically design of God for human sexuality. It goes on from there, but 2021, that is what was said. That's what was said in 2021. Now, Fernandez is saying this is a development of that, and this is not a contradiction. But remember, I just read to you what it said, that there appears a possibility of blessing for couples in irregular situations and for couples of the same sex. The word couples there is the biggest deal. Now, we're going to go back to what Father James Martin is talking about here. Let's play that.
Build on, or does it contradict the 2021 statement? Can you explain that a little bit?
I think it doesn't contradict it in that it doesn't set up sacramental marriage for same-sex couples, right? So it is not saying that the traditional teaching is now abrogated, but it is a development. I mean, I think we have to be clear. Sometimes people sort of skirt around these issues, but this is a change, and doctrine does develop. We know that most recently, for example, on the death penalty, probably the most public example, when there was still a bit of an opening, and now the door is shut on that, on the death penalty. Further back, we have the Second Vatican Council with changed teaching on our relation with non-Christian denominations. I mean, this is a big deal. He's very clearly saying that things have changed. That's what he's saying. So I think these things will have to be addressed and more. I mean, these things will just have to keep being addressed and break down piece by piece, because this is probably the most clear, disastrous situation we found ourselves. But we have to remember, we must always pray daily for the virtues of calm, courage, and confidence, recognizing that Our Lady said,
that these things would happen. She said there would be bishop against bishop, priest against priest, but in the end, her immaculate heart will triumph. So do not despair. We'll be right back. We've been talking about the document, let me see if I can pronounce it correctly, Fiducia Supplicans. I think that's right.
That sounds pretty
right.
close. I'll give you like a, I don't know, like a 7 out of 10.
You know, I'll be honest. I get classical and ecclesiastical Latin confused. And so whenever it has like the CI, I'm always like, is it fiducia or fiducia? The sh or the
Fiducia Supplicans.
Here's another thing. Okay, side note, you just made me think of it because you gave that accent. Why is the title in Latin? There's no Latin text.
Yeah, they haven't released the Latin text
because
yet.
the way they name the
hilarious.
documents is they take the first 2 words or first couple words of the text in Latin, and that's the name of the document. But there is no official Latin text.
Yeah, there's Italian.
It's basically
Spanish,
every major language.
Every major, except for Latin.
Except for Latin, which most people will be like, that's not a big deal, whatever, right? But it actually is a big deal because the Latin text has always been considered the official text of the document. So if there's confusion about a translation issue or what does a word mean, you should go back to the Latin. This obviously is for scholars. Yeah, for context.
Yeah.
This is for scholars, of course, because I mean, I don't read Latin. My Latin is very, very poor. I did not do great in my Latin classes.
The only Latin I know is lorem ipsum.
Lorem ipsum, the one
As
that
a graphic designer, it's just like garbled placeholder text. Lorem ipsum, dolor.
That's hilarious. But it's interesting though, because the argument about, okay, what does the text say? It creates more ambiguity because people are saying, okay, well, I guess we're going to just treat the Italian like the original text, or we're going to treat the Spanish like the original text since Spanish is Pope Francis' first language and Fernandez's first language. And so now there's debate about even that, which I thought was interesting because Diane Montagna, who is a journalist out of Rome, she came out and said, question, what's the basis for the claim that the Vatican Declaration endorses blessings only for individuals and not for couples? Which I was like, thank you. That's what I'm trying to say. She says individuals, the word individuals appears once in English, but is rendered them in all the other languages. Individually appears once, but it can't support this claim. The declaration issued by Cardinal Fernandez and signed by Pope Francis intends to offer an innovative contribution based on the pastoral visions of Pope Francis. That's a quote from the document. That enables one to understand, this is also a quote from the document, understand the possibility of blessing couples in irregular situations and same-sex couples. So, yeah, that's kind of the big deal because, yeah, people are saying, well, the word individual pops up in the English. It only pops up one time. But Diane even makes the point. That's not there in the other languages. That's only there in the English, which is kind of surprising to me. And that it's difficult because I only speak English. So I don't know how to see these things in other places. Now, there's a number of other things that were very concerning. For instance, the development of doctrine. And we're playing that clip of Father James Martin talking about his understanding and development of doctrine. And this is where I think he's actually incorrect about. Usually, the majority of what he's saying, I kind of am like, yeah, I mean, he's telling the truth about what the document is. I disagree with that he's happy about it, but he's telling the truth. And this is probably the only part where I kind of disagree with Father Martin about this. Let's finish out that clip.
Opening, and now the door is shut on that, on the death penalty. Further back, we have the Second Vatican Council with changed teaching on our relation with non-Christian denominations. I mean, for a time you couldn't set foot in the Protestant church. That has definitely changed, right? And so it is a development, and it's a deepening, and it's also the reflection on people's experiences. This was talked about a lot at the Synod, that the church is invited to, and has always been invited to, reflect on how the Holy Spirit is at work in different people's experiences, and in this case, in the experiences of same-sex couples and other couples.
It's developing, and it's meant to be moving in a more pastoral and open direction. So, for example, just within the last few months, the Vatican has declared that trans people can be baptized, can serve as godparents, which...
So now I can go in my collar in some public setting and bless a same-sex couple, which I could not do before. right? I mean, imagine if you saw me with my hand up and blessing over a same-sex couple holding hands or something. I would have gotten into trouble. Now I will not. As long as it's not in the context of a wedding. It's a big change for priests. I'd heard that this was at least being discussed in the Vatican when I was at the Synod in terms of kind of framing it as a theology of blessing. And I think it's a significant step forward. I've already heard from people who say it's too much. That's always the case with these things. It's either too little, too late, or way too much, and I'm leaving the church, which I think means that Pope Francis and the Vatican are trying to thread the needle on this.
Yes, for sure. And I think that what he says here is very, very interesting because he says that he heard at the Synod. So this was premeditated. This was planned for months. And they told us, people were like, oh, I can't believe this happened. Fernandez told us a document was coming out in December, and people were saying it's a Amoris Laetitia 2.0. And I think this is it. And here he says, yeah, they were talking about it. I heard people talking about it. And I heard they're going to frame it as a development of doctrine on the theology of blessings. This is important to note because the development of doctrine is such a misunderstood doctrine because people think the development of doctrine means doctrine can change. It cannot. It is very, very clear. The church has always taught. You think about like St. Vincent of Lérins, for instance, talks extensively on this. It's very clear that we cannot have doctrine change entirely to a different meaning. Development of doctrine means that we create more nuance into a doctrine. We have a greater understanding of a doctrine. We may draw out a more precise language with a doctrine. That's development of doctrine. What development of doctrine is not is that something means something totally different from what it meant before. Then it's not development. It just changed. It's something different. And that's what cannot happen. And this is what he's saying, Father James Martin is saying, is happening. He's saying it is, in fact, a change. And from my perspective, I think he's right that it is a change. But what I disagree with him is that I disagree that it can be called a development of doctrine. Because this is a major, major problem. Because if things can change or they attempt to change things, well, that has a major, major effect on us. Now, one of the other things about the document was the straw man that were created throughout the document. It was actually kind of frustrating to me personally. They were saying some people would say that you cannot present yourself for a blessing unless you are perfect. And I was thinking, who says that? Who can you show me the person who says that if you can't present yourself for a blessing unless you have, quote, prior moral perfection? That's a straw man. There's not a single person who would say that. In fact, I went to go find, because I was like, okay, let's see. Let's go find the most radical traditionalist organization and see what they have to say about blessings. And so, lucky enough, the Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X put out a statement about this document, and this is what he said about blessings. He says, doubtless, every man can be helped by the prevenient mercy of God and discover with confidence that he is called to convert in order to receive the salvation that God offers him. And Holy Church never refuses a blessing to sinners who legitimately ask for it. But then, this blessing has no other object than to help the soul to overcome sin in order to live in a state of grace. Holy Church can therefore bless any individual, even a pagan, but never in any way can it bless a union that is sinful in itself, under the pretext of encouraging what is good in it. There, he's referring to the fact that Pope Francis's document clearly stated, oh, we're blessing the good aspects of the couple, the good aspects of the relationship, because, there's faithfulness there, there's loyalty there, there's love there, and that's what we're blessing. And so that's what he's responding to. He says, when we bless a couple, we do not bless isolated individuals. We necessarily bless the relationship that unites them. However, we cannot redeem an intrinsically bad and scandalous reality. Such encouragement to proceed pastorally with these blessings leads in practice inexorably to the systematic acceptance of situations incompatible with the moral law, whatever else is said. So, that's from the Society of St. Pius X, which are labeled the radical traditionalists, right? And so if anybody was going to say, no, you can never bless sinners, it would be them, right? And that's not what he says. He says, no, we can bless anybody, even a pagan. But it's in the context of praying for them to have a conversion of soul, praying for them that they repent of their sin. And for example, if someone goes to confession, this probably just never happens anymore, but theoretically this could happen, and technically priests should do this. But if the priest detects that you're not truly contrite of heart and that you're not really having an amendment of life in the confessional, he cannot give you absolution, but instead will give you a blessing. But that blessing is for you to have a contrite heart, for you to have an amendment of life. Or you think about when you go to confession and the first thing you say is, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is the first thing you say. So of course, there is no Catholic, no matter how radical he is, radical traditionalist that he might be, is saying that you have to be perfect to receive a blessing. We're not asking you to be perfect. We're just asking you to try or to want to be perfect. I think that's the essential thing of it, because that's my prayer a lot of times. I think about the prayer of St. Augustine where he says, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. And I think about that because I'm like, Lord, make me perfect, or at the least make me want to be perfect. I want to want your will is something I say often, because sometimes I'm like, I know God would probably want me to fast, but that chocolate cake looks really good right now. And I go and eat the chocolate cake. And I'm like, God, let me want your will. I want to want your will. But right now, I don't quite want it all the time because it's a little difficult, I'm not going to lie. And that's kind of my conversation with God sometimes. And so, yes, 100%, if you want a blessing, go seek a blessing. And any priest will give it to you. But we cannot bless situations that are intrinsically evil, that are sinful. And yes, sodomy is, in fact, a mortal sin. 1 Peter 5 put out a great article on the topic when he was talking about this, Timothy Flanders, and he made the point, well, what if the mafia came by with his group and were like, hey, Father, can you bless us? We're going to go whack somebody. Can you go bless us? We want to make sure everything goes well. Would he say, okay, that's an irregular situation, but we'll bless that relationship because you guys all love each other? Like the mafia, I mean, they're tight. Big family, very loyal to one another. And so we'll bless the mafia, but we're not going to bless the murder and the espionage and the drug trades. We're not blessing that. We're just blessing the brotherly love that the mafiosos have for one another. If they did that, people would be rightly scandalized. People would rightly be flabbergasted by that kind of reaction. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're having these discussions. The last thing that I'll note here on this topic, is during today, the rest of Advent is a season of penance, technically. I know, surprising, right? It's a season of penance. And specifically today, Friday, and Saturday are rogation days. Or not rogation days, Ember days. There we go. Our Ember days. And Ember days, it's not binding in the church anymore. We've kind of got rid of them over the last few years. And so I call it a holy day of opportunity. A holy day of opportunity. You're not required to do it. A holy day of opportunity where the days where you can fast and pray for the church. And so I'm going to encourage you, and I'm going to do my best to join you in doing this. I invite you to join me. We're getting ready for Christmas. Let's go to confession. Go to confession with me. I'm going to try to go to confession maybe today or tomorrow if I can. Go to confession with me. And let's fast and pray the rest of Advent. Let's fast and pray for the church, for the conversion of sinners, for the liberty and exaltation of Holy Mother Church, for the salvation of souls. Let's do that together. Will you do that with me? I would really appreciate it. I wanted to read something that I got yesterday. It said, my husband is on the cusp of conversion. And just when I feel like he takes a few good solid steps forward, something like this happens and he steps back. I'm not sure how many times in the past year or two I've said the teachings cannot change. He doesn't understand. He's seen what happened to the Anglican Church and he thinks that we are on our way. And I truly believe we aren't. I do believe that a lot of Catholics wish it, and that maybe when Father James Martin ultimately does get the boot and starts his own Protestant group, they'll join him. Then we can put all this aside and keep on walking in the truth. Well, I feel your pain, and this has been certainly an apologetics nightmare for anybody who's trying to explain the teaching of the church, not because it's impossible to explain, but just it becomes much more complicated to explain. It's much more difficult. You got to explain the teaching of the church on homosexuality, you got to teach about the papacy, about the infallibility of the papacy, about magisterial acts. I mean, it just becomes a whole ginormous smorgasbord of things to talk about, whereas before it was much more straightforward.
Yeah, you got to become a theologian now to explain something simple, and it's really complicated. And the worst part of it is that there's souls at stake. There are people who are on the cusp of conversion, like this dear listener who sent that information in. And, it's going to be a driving force in either direction. And I think it's going in the negative direction.
I think so too. So I wanted to share with you some positive developments, though. Some positive developments has been the reaction that we got. And you might remember, I think it was last week. The days kind of blend together. I think it was last week where we played a clip from Cardinal Arenze and from Cardinal Sarah about what he had to say about some of these things that we're talking about. And I mentioned, I love the church in Africa. The church in Africa is
solid.
Yeah, I was going to say poppin', but solid is a much better word.
Poppin', a theological term.
Yes, theological precision from Adrian Fonseca. It is a poppin'. And I just got to say, I love the church in Africa because over the last 24 hours, the church in Africa has been coming out in force talking about this document. The Zimbayas, and I'm probably going to mispronounce African words and African names, the bishops came out and they joined in with their counterparts in Malawi. Malawi? Is that really how you pronounce it?
Malawi.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. I definitely
They have
never
great
heard
peppers
that one.
there, too,
Really?
by the way. Peppadew peppers from Malawi. Woo-wee!
Okay.
Good stuff. Good on pizza.
All right, noted. And so they joined in and they started saying they will not be implementing the Vatican's declaration regarding same-sex blessings. They released two different documents, one from one bishop's conference and one from the other, and they are both affirming the same thing, where they reaffirm the church's teaching, and they reaffirm that they will not be implementing these actions. And the Nigerian bishops, they came out as well. And I'm like, man, Africa is on fire right now. And they came out, they said, there is no possibility in the church of blessing same-sex unions and activities that would go against God's law, the teaching of the church, the laws of our nation, and the cultural sensibilities of our people. We kind of think that everybody's like America, everybody's like the West. It's simply not the case, and I think it's very good to see that. Obviously, there are bad news. Some of the bishops, like in Switzerland and Germany, and there's a couple other countries who came out and were like, oh, this is so great. We'll be implementing this now. No priest is allowed to deny it. And I'm like, okay, well, that's happening, but there is good news. There is still good news. Another one is Bishop Confraternity of Clergy, which the British Confraternity of Clergy, which I'm not familiar with. I don't know anything about this group, but they came out with a statement saying, we see no situation in which such a blessing of a couple could be properly and adequately distinguished from some level of approval, and it would inevitably lead to scandal. We conclude that such blessings are pastorally and practically inadmissible. So praise be to God. And there's a number of statements just like this one from bishops. For instance, there is the bishop from the Metropolitan Archbishop of the Archdiocese of St. Mary and Astana, which if maybe another day we'll read you that one because he does a great job of explaining the teachings of the church and why that he is not going to be following this. And so praise be to God for that. I also want to share with you a couple of clips of video. There was a couple of videos that I saw that just really struck me, and I thought it was very beautiful to put together. So I put these 3 videos together for you to just watch all in one go. And so here is the topic. It's going to be Mother Angelica. It's going to be Bishop Fulton Sheen and Bishop Strickland, and I kind of put them all together in sequential form. And I think it'll be a great little catechesis on the situation here from the past. So we'll play that video for you.
Bishop Sheen, do you foresee in the distant future any change in the church's stand, the Catholic Church's stand, and certain issues today which have been quite controversial? Do you foresee ever any change in that?
No.
Not at all?
No, because we have no power over the divine law. Furthermore, suppose we did. Suppose John Paul II tomorrow said, all right, bring out your contraceptives. Pull out your scalpels. Unplug the children from their wombs. Marry as you please. Unmarry as you please. Fornicate as you please. What would be the difference between the church and the world?
Well, Mother, I'm gay and find it difficult to be gay and Catholic. And I was just wondering if you have any suggestions of what I should do.
Well, when a person says, I am gay, which you just said, it's hard to understand what you mean. Does you mean you have the inclination? Well, you can certainly be a very wonderful Catholic and have the inclination. Now, if you say you're actively gay, it's impossible. Why? Because to be actively gay is to commit grave sin. See? It is to go against the law of God. And I wish I could put it better for you. I wish I could soften it. But see, I really feel that there's something else. See? Sexuality is only one part of us. And there's so much, I'll bet, there's so much you can give to God. And even though you have an inclination, and even though you find it very difficult to overcome, you can with the grace of God. And you can become very holy. That's why it's so important that we have the Eucharist. The Eucharist is that power within us to help us all overcome our faults and weaknesses. We all have faults and weaknesses. Some are angry when they were born. They're born angry. We all have a sinner condition to fight with. But you can't. Don't get discouraged, please. Pray more. Do things for people that are ill, that are lonely. Read some good books by the Holy Fathers, by the spiritual writers. That's a weakness you can overcome. And no one, for example, if someone says, well, I like robbing banks. Well, you say you can't be a Catholic and be a very happy bank robber. You see, I cannot say I love God and then I'm willing to offend God. So I will pray for you. I don't know your name. But there are many gays who watch this network. I know you do. Because you're unhappy with yourself. But you can overcome. You can become a great, great saint. Because of the power of confession and the power of the Eucharist. Body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you shall not have what in you? Life.
Make a comment about this recent document on blessing same-sex couples. We really simply need to be a united voice saying, no, we will not respond to this. We will not incorporate this into the life of the church because we simply must say no. And it needs to be a united voice. In history, with the kinds of issues that we're facing, a pope would call for a council. That isn't likely to happen now, but we need a united voice, something like a council, to address the confusion and the issues that continually arise, to know the truth of Jesus Christ that is unchanging. I ask my brother bishops that we all join with a voice of strength and joy in the Lord in these last days of Advent and say no to this latest document and ask for a clarification of the true teachings of our Catholic faith. The Church is the bride of Christ. Let us rejoice in being members of this mystical body, the Church.
Thank you very much to Archbishop Fulton Sheen, Mother Angelica, and Bishop Strickland. That was very beautiful. And if you would like to see those videos as we play the audio, you can always hop onto our social media feeds, look up Catholic Drive Time in your favorite social media feed, and we would love to have you join us and interact with us directly. We're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, you are our guest. Call now to talk about your favorite Christmas movie. We'll be right back. We are going to go through just one chapter of this book. I highly recommend getting it. It's definitely worth it. But I want to go through this one chapter because I think it's worth knowing, considering the situation that we find ourselves in today. And it does a good job of explaining why we see the confusion at the Vatican and understanding why these things are happening, in my opinion, helps us to be less scandalized by it whenever it happens. That's why whenever these things happen, I'm like, it's bad, but I'm never scandalized. I'm not like, oh no, I'm going to lose my faith, because I expect it to happen. It's what I expect to see. And that's just simply the case. And so I think it's a good book to go through. So we'll go through it. So we're going to go through, I'll start from the beginning. So you may have heard some of this already if you have been tuning in for a while. It is 10 pages in length. So we'll go through the pages. All right. First answer, a rule of hermeneutics. In the face of this objection, we will not consider the particular cases alleged here. And although the traditional affirmation is pushed aside, as it were, by what is opposed to it. We have demonstrated this in the previous chapter and shall show this further in those that follow. What we shall consider in the abstract is the principle that the objection enunciates. The obscure and suspect-sounding passages of a document do not become suspect when, in the same document, there are also orthodox ones dealing with the same topics. It behooves us to give a first answer of a hermeneutical order, which we expound here in outline form. A. In principle, the rule according to which the confused and obscure text of a document should be interpreted by those that are clear is true. B. This rule, however, according to which suspect the heterodox texts must be interpreted by orthodox ones, requires a distinction. This rule is applicable when the suspect of heterodox passages occur only one or another time by mistake, as it were. But the rule does not hold when the suspect or heterodox passages are numerous, for that which happens by mistake is by nature occasional and infrequent. In such cases, one should have recourse to other rules and means of interpretation. When in addition to being numerous, the confused, suspect, and heterodox passages form one linked to another a system of thought, the above rule of interpretation does not hold. Instead, the opposite rule applies. It is necessary then to ask if it is not the orthodox text which should be interpreted in the light of confused, suspect, and heterodox passages. Let us explain this principle in greater detail. Lapses are not usually frequent, and above all, cannot constitute a system. Therefore, in the hypothesis which has been explained, it is not legitimate to interpret the non-orthodox passages by the orthodox ones. Although the latter passages point to orthodoxy of the document, it is impossible to eliminate or lessen the suspicion of heterodoxy due to the context. Furthermore, considering the situation only in the abstract, it is not licit to forget that, at least until breaking with the Church, heretics usually present their doctrine by alternating orthodox passages with confused, ambiguous, suspect, and heterodox ones. Accordingly, in the hypothesis being analyzed, in addition to losing much of their favorable significance, the orthodox texts raise one more reason for grave suspicion. We desire to abstract from person and ponder the matter with all scientific rigor. It is necessary, therefore, to ask if it is not in the obscure and suspect passages that one will find the true key to the full comprehension of the text, including the real meaning of the seemingly orthodox parts.
In other words, it behooves us to ask if in reality one should not interpret the orthodox passages through those which disagree with good doctrine. This leads us to a second answer to be given to the objection we formulated. Second answer, the contradictory character of all heresies. In addition to the above rule of hermeneutics in contributing to making it more explicit, we must also consider arguments of another order. It is impossible to treat seriously on the scientific plane matters such as those now before us without recourse to the assistance of history, of the history of heresies. No, assistance to history. Thus, it seems indispensable to present some observations founded upon the modus operandi, the mode of operation of heretics over the centuries. A superficial study of the history of heresies is enough for us to see that all of them tried to disguise their real intentions, at least until their definitive break with the Catholic Church. Bishop Antonio de Castromayo writes, "This tendency to reconcile irreconcilable extremes, to find a middle line between truth and error, manifested itself from the beginning of the Church. When Arianism was condemned, the tendency gave birth to semi-Arianism. When Pelagianism was condemned, it engendered semi-Pelagianism. When Protestantism was condemned at Trent, it morphed into Jansenism. And from it was born in the same way the modernism condemned by Blessed Pius X, that monstrous confluence of atheism, rationalism, evolutionism, and pantheism. In a school that desired to stab the church from behind, the objective of the modernist sect was always to remain within the church and falsify true doctrine, which it exteriorly pretended to accept, through sophisms, inferences, and reservations. This tendency has not ceased yet. One could even say it forms part of church history," end quote. Strictly speaking, an attentive consideration of this magnificent statement of the illustrious Bishop of Campos would be enough for us to comprehend how much caution and suspicion are necessary in reading the traditional or seemingly traditional passages that the progressivists place right beside their obscure and suspect affirmations. Such a strange coexistence of opposing assertions leads us to focus on yet another aspect of the history of heresies. In addition to disguising themselves, heretics have the habit of admitting when necessarily openly contradictory principles. Frequently, they place alongside an error a truth that is opposed to it. With that tactic, they can always allege, if questioned, that the heterodox passage should be understood according to the orthodox one. To their proselytes, however, they teach that, in reality, the erroneous thesis prevails. Let me just pause there for a second. Let me read that again, because this is it. This is the statement. I should have read this part on there. Maybe I'll read it tomorrow. With that tactic, they can always allege, if questioned, that the heterodox passage should be understood according to the orthodox one. But to their proselytes, they teach that in reality, the erroneous thesis prevails. This is exactly why I was quoting James Martin in the context, because he is one of the proselytes. And then all the other people, who we call pope-splainers, are saying, no, you got to read it in light of the orthodox passage. Interesting, right? All right, we continue. History furnishes us with many examples of such contradictions of heretics. Let us analyze some of them briefly. A. Arianism. It is not rare to see contradictions among heresiarchs reach the point of lying. The false oath of fidelity to the Catholic faith made by Arius before Emperor Constantine is very well known. I'll read the footnote because the footnote here matters. Doubting the sincerity of Arius, Constantine allegedly said to him, "If your faith is truly orthodox, you did well in making this oath. If it is impious, then may God judge you for your oath." St. Alexander, the old bishop of the imperial city, begged God to either take him from this world or prevent the rehabilitation of Arius. That same day, when he was crossing the city accompanied by numerous retinue, Arius suffered an abominable death, so that the ancient historians applied to him the words of Scripture about Judas. Diffusa sunt viscera eius. There you go. B. Pelagianism. The Pelagians frequently refer to the redemption, Whoever reads them without remembering that the heretics usually use contradiction to dupe their adversaries could believe that they accepted the idea of redemption. Nothing is falser. In Dictionary de Théologie Catholique, R. Haid and E. Amon explain that Pelagianism was about abolishing the Christian idea of redemption. Undoubtedly, the Pelagians spoke very much about the redemption. They kept the word, not the thing. They referred to the remission of sins founded on the death of Christ, but their manner of comprehending sin and its effects on man obliged them to interpret this remission in the nominalist sense of non-imputation of the sins committed. It is nothing more than exterior justification. So nominalism meaning just saying the words. The words are all that matter. And non-imputation meaning it's not actually imputed unto you. Instead, it's more like, it's laid very in a very Lutheran manner. It covers you. Many other contradictions among the Pelagians constituted true lies. In 415, a synod was convened in Diospolis to judge the heretics Pelagius and Celestus. After careful examination of the writing of Celestus, the synod condemned him. The works of Pelagius were not analyzed. The fathers judged him based only on his declaration at the synod, and they absolved him. After reproducing St. Augustine's observations about the episode, Head and Amon write, "The charity of St. Augustine makes him add that he did not wish to affirm that Pelagius had lied in denying his doctrines." This, however, is the conclusion one must accept. Pelagius could not have been absolved by the synod of Diospolis, except thanks to omissions that are strangely similar to lies. End quote. Later, the same perfidy of Pelagius and his followers deceived Pope St. Zosimus, having convoked a synod in Rome in 417, especially to judge the Pelagians, and immediately proceeding to a careful examination of his errors. The Pope ended up by absolving Pelagius and some of his defenders. In a September 21st, 417 letter to the bishops of Africa, St. Zosimus reproached them for having believed the accusations against Pelagius. After describing the joy that the profession of faith of the Pelagians had caused to the holy men there present, the Pope added that some were scarcely able to control their sighs and tears on seeing how men of such perfect faith could have been so calumniated. Does it remind you of anything of people being like, "You're calumniating the Pope, you're calumniating Francis and Fernandez, you're making things up, you're being uncharitable, I'm calling you to repentance." Does that sound familiar? St. Zosimus attached certain writings of Pelagius to that letter and said to the bishops of Africa, quote, "The reading of these texts will probably bring you as much joy as it did to us," end quote. Lies were really frequent among the Pelagians. St. Augustine said, quote, "Always so moderate," end quote. Observe Haid and Amon, said of another of them, Julianus de Aclana, that he was untruthful in his profession of faith. So they espoused the truth of the faith, but they did not actually believe it. They lied. You can't trust modernists. I mean, it's simply it. Okay, C, monothelitism. Regarding monothelitism, M. Juge writes, I'm not going to say four names. It is the chameleon heresy par excellence. In the measure in which it was unmasked and met resistance, it retreated and made concessions so that its point of arrival was in perfect contradiction with that of its departure. So there you go. Protestantism, D. Luther's contradictions are patent in his liturgical reform and the doctrines with which he pretended to justify it. Studying the Lutheran theory about the real presence, J. Pacqua wrote, "When is Jesus Christ present in the bread and wine? Generally, Luther tells us that he is present only at the moment of consecration and communion. But on this point, as in others, his contradictions are abundant." Now, Luther contradicted himself quite a bit, and honestly, can't tell if he's a liar or I'm talking to a lot of people about it, and a lot of people think he was actually just not very smart. So Anyway, Luther never got to the point of implementing his true concepts about the liturgy. Quote, however the changes were made timely, it is what was required by a certain good sense of Luther and the falsity of his attitudes. It was necessary to put people to sleep, end quote. Despite his violent attack against the Roman Mass, Luther nevertheless permitted his followers to celebrate it when necessary, as long as they interpreted the formula of the Missal according to their new concepts. In addition, in many places, he maintained the traditional ceremonies he vitupered. I don't know what that word means. Vitupered so furiously. However, these were now no more than mere appearances indeed of their content. See then how gravely deceived would be anyone who, in assisting at Lutheran liturgical ceremonies, deemed it impossible that true heretics were celebrating them, because they match or almost match the Catholic ones. St. Robert Bellarmine gives another characteristic example of Protestant contradiction in preaching. It is noted by, quote, it is noted by Frederick Staphylos that in the beginning the Lutherans made the church invisible. Then at length, when they saw the absurdity which followed thence, by a secret council they established that the church may be said to be visible, but still by this name of visible they mean really invisible, end quote. Does that make sense? No, it does not. But that's kind of the point, is that it's contradictory. And the citation is on councils on the church bulletin, on the marks of the church, translated by Mediatrix Press. There you go. And E, Jansenism. One of the principal errors of the Holy See condemned in Jansen was his notion of liberty. Now this is interesting. In the final analysis of his heretical thesis was the denial of human liberty. However, in his principal work, Augustinus, this thesis, while it was there, was continuously disguised in ambiguous propositions, spacious distinctions, and deceptive formulations. Notice here, ambiguous propositions, so proposing things that could be read in a number of different ways, spacious distinctions, so making a distinction that really does not a real distinction, kind of like, I don't know, blessing the couple, but not the relationship. You're blessing the individuals of the couple, but not the relationship that the couple is. That's kind of what the new document is saying, right? Or at least people who are defending the document are saying. That's a spacious distinction. And then deceptive formulations. In this, nothing merits special mention, for it is known that the heretics have always sought to dissemble their heresies to better deceive the incautious. This is why we have to be cautious. This is why I talk about a hermeneutic of suspicion, which people tell me that I should not have a hermeneutic of suspicion, but nonetheless, here we are. In addition to ambiguities and sophisms, though, Jansen fell into direct and open contradiction on this and other points. After exposing Jansen's error about human liberty, J. Carrard writes in Dictionnaire de Theologico Catholique, quote, at times, Jansen appears to modify his mode of expression. Thus, he says that to be free is to be master of oneself and to have in one's power one's own acts, and concludes that the indeliberate movements which precede the reason are not free, end quote. An ingenuous spirit eager to prove Jansen, Bishop of Erps, innocent of the accusation of heresy, would see in these passages a complete proof of his orthodoxy. That was the interpretation that his disciples gave to the work of the Master, denying that it contained the errors condemned by Innocent X. Carrard gives us the real explanation of these texts. So we'll notice here, before I read this, notice here, this text, which is in fact the heterodox text itself, is being defended by bishops, by good bishops, because they are trying to interpret it in an orthodox manner. So read this. And we know for a fact that this is wrong because he's been publicly condemned by the church for a very long time. So here is the explanation. However, in these passages and other similar ones, Jansen interprets the previously mentioned expression in an altogether special sense. It is commonly said that an act is in our power when it depends on us to practice it or not, when we can select between two actions so that our will is not determined to that act. According to Jansen, it is enough that the will not be constrained by coercion or exterior violence for one to be able to say that the act is in our power. For Jansen, the power to select good or evil consists only in the fact of the will desiring or acting spontaneously and with delight, not under constraint, violence, or coercion. Therefore, it is only a question of power without coercion and violence, and not a faculty which freely and on its own can select this or that. So what is it saying? What does that mean? Basically what it's saying is that by freedom, he's not meaning freedom. And by power, he's not meaning power. He's using a different definition for both of those words than what the Catholic understanding of those words would mean. And so whenever you read it as a Catholic, you're like, oh yeah, I agree with that. That's 100% true. But then you talk to Jansenists and they're like, oh yeah, but we know it's really up. And that's basically what he's saying here. He goes on and says, it is not only in their directly doctrinal declarations that heretics do not hesitate, when necessary, to contradict their own ideas head on. An example of this is the approval given by Jansen to the book Grandeur de Jesus by Cardinal de Broglie. Since this book contained affirmations opposed to certain Jansenist doctrines, an unwary observer could believe that in giving such approval, the Bishop of Ypres was expressing his authentic thinking concerning those doctrines. However, the truth is that Jansen approved the work only to gain Cardinal de Broglie's sympathy, and is known that he deliberately did not read the book before approving it because he was afraid to find passages contrary to his own ideas. So what do we see here? Jansen approves of Orthodox books that contradicts the things that he's saying and gives a thumbs up to it. He's like, yeah, 100%. He didn't even read the book. And this is to be reminded, because even whenever we see bad people doing good things does not make them good. Because goodness, or we might say virtue is the habitual doing of the good. So if you do bad things a lot and occasionally do something good, that does not mean that we should then give you the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, we're going to interpret the actions that you can take as good whenever they are not. And we can say, oh yeah, that one thing. So, okay, yeah, Jansen gave the approval to a good book. Okay, praise be to God. We move on. We don't say, therefore, Jansen was Orthodox and Jansen is good. Okay, F, modernism. This is the fun one. Concerning the flagrant contradiction of modernists, St. Pius X wrote, this becomes still clearer to anybody who studies the conduct of modernists, which is in perfect harmony with their teachings. In the writings and addresses, they seem not unfrequently to advocate now one doctrine, now another, so that one would be disposed to regard them as vague and doubtful. But there is a reason for this, and it is to be found in their ideas as to the mutual separation of science and faith. By science, hold on, I got frozen there for a second. Hence, in their books, you find some things which might well be expressed by a Catholic, but in the next page, you find other things which might have been dictated by a rationalist. When they write history, they make no mention of the divinity of Christ, but when they are in the pulpit, they profess it clearly. Again, when they write history, they pay no heed to the fathers and the councils, but when they catechize the people, they cite them respectfully. In the same way, they draw their distinctions between theological and pastoral exegesis and scientific and historical exegesis. Okay, this is a big deal, and I recommend reading Pascendi, which is a document of Pius X. We talked about it on the show, and that's the passage we're quoting. This is very clear. This is what's happening. They will say something orthodox, and the next page say something heretical. And if you listen to the Holy Father, for instance, when he talks in his Angelus sermons, when he gives his Wednesday audiences, sometimes it sounds fine. There's nothing explicitly wrong with what he's saying. And I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. But then you see his documents, and his documents are like, that's not quite what we're seeing here. What do we see? What do we see? G, the anti-liturgical heresy. In the Institutions liturgiques, Dom Guéranger highlights the contradiction proper to heretics in the matter of worship. He enunciates 14 principles that govern what he calls the anti-liturgical heresy. That is to say, the common substrat of the liturgical innovations of all heresies. We reproduce here the fourth principle enunciated by Dom Guéranger, which from certain points of view bears on the matter being treated. After referring incidentally in the first 3 points to various contradictions of the heretics, he writes, so he mentions in the first 3 points, I haven't read this before, the Institute, I've read this chapter before, I've read those quotes before, but the thing he's citing, I've never read it before, so he's saying that the first 3 sections on it, he points out the contradictions of the heretics, and then here's the 4th point that he makes. Paragraph 4. We should not be surprised at the contradiction heresy presents in its works when we consider the 4th principle, or if you wish, the 4th necessity imposed on the sectarians by the very nature of their state of revolt, an habitual contradiction with their own principles. It must be so for their own confusion on the great day, which sooner or later has to come, in which God shall reveal the nakedness of heretics before the eyes of the people, whom they deceived, and also because it is not proper to men to be consistent, only the truth can be so. I'm going to pause right there. This is why it's very important to be truthful. This is why lying is really bad, because you will be caught out. You will make a contradiction. No matter how smart or clever you are, you will make a mistake. This is why I refuse to lie. Well, that's not why, but that's one reason. One reason I refuse to lie is because I don't want to be caught in a contradiction. I don't want to have to try to remember what I said or didn't say. I don't want to have to do that. I already struggled with that with trying to keep private things private, like the news that we're going to be releasing soon. I just keeping that private thing, which is not lying, it's just keeping things private. Now I got to remember, what did I say? What did I not say? Now imagine if I lied. Now I got to keep track of my lies. That's insanity. And so no, only like if men try to be consistent, we will fail. Only the truth can be consistent. Okay, continuing. Thus, without exception, all the sectarians begin by crying out for the rights of antiquity. They want to purge Christianity of all that is false and unworthy of God, which the errors and passions of men have introduced. They desire nothing but the ancient, to seek to take up the Christian institution in its crib once again. Does that sound familiar to you? Like people saying, oh, we got to go back to the early church. We got to go back to the way it was done before. Oh, yes, that's the way they did it in the past. For this reason, they mutilate, destroy, and cut. Everything falls before their blows. And when one expects to see the divine worship reappear in its first purity, behold, it is filled with the new formulae, which date from no earlier than yesterday, and are incaustically human, for those who have written them are still alive. All the sects are subject to this necessity. Before I go on, what they're saying is, these people, because he's talking about the context of liturgy, these people will create liturgies, will say that it comes from the early church, and you're like, how can it be from the early church if the people who created the liturgy are still alive? If I can go talk to the people who designed the liturgy, how is that ancient? How is that old? And so that's what he's saying. We see this in the monophysites and the Nestorians, and we shall encounter the same thing in all branches of Protestantism. The ostination which they preach antiquity does nothing more than position them to attack everything of the past. Afterward, they go before the people who have been seduced and swear that everything is good, that the papal excrescences have disappeared. Excrescences have disappeared, and the divine worship has returned to its ancient sanctity. Does that sound familiar to you? We shall note something else characteristic of liturgical modifications made by heretics. In their fury of innovations, they are not content with mutilating the formula of ecclesiastical style, stigmatized by them as human words. Rather, they extend their reprobation to the very readings and prayers that the church has taken from Scripture. They change them, replace them, not wishing to pray with the church, excommunicating themselves in this way, fearing even the least bit of orthodoxy that presided over the selection of those passages. Okay, how many more pages? 1, 2, 3, 4 pages left. 4 pages, almost done. The third answer, neo-modernist metaphysics. The cited passage of St. Pius X, I think it's funny how he switches between Blessed Pius X earlier. Because he was quoting somebody else. The cited passage of St. Pius X about the contradictions of modernists is particularly illuminating. It reveals that it is not only because of tactics that they are not ashamed to affirm on one page that they have been denied, that they have just denied on the previous one. It follows a system. This is very, 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 very important. And this is going to get a little bit complicated, and we're just going to plow through it because he's going to mention a bunch of jargon, and we're just going to plow through it and just move on, and we're not going to spend any time on it. But this is important because he's talking about it follows a system. So the errors are systematic, are consistent errors. And many people have done this already, where they will trace the lineage of Francis's documents. Or you go through the Mors Laetitia, you go through the Synod on Synodality, you go through the Amazon Synod, you go through the first, second, and third comments on the homosexuals, and then you go to the current document. You see a consistent pattern of behavior, consistent errors that are there over and over and over again, heading in the same direction. It becomes a system of thought. It's not just a single error. It's actually a tactic. Okay, continuing. Something analogous occurs with progressivists who recycle modernism into terms adapted to our days. Indeed, in addition to the enumerated tactical reason, the progressivists have another motive to defend seemingly traditional positions, side by side with heterodox ones. The numenology they subscribe to in the philosophical domain leads to extreme relativist metaphysics. The eclectic paroxysms amalgamates all past and present philosophies: Hegelianism, existentialism, personalism, the Gnostic doctrines of the East and the West, liberalism, Marxism, and the like. How could they fail to include Thomism? But how could they add to it if Thomism is the very denial of the relativistic syncretism? This difficulty is easy to resolve in numenological terms. It's enough, for example, to put into parentheses the foundational objectivism of Thomism, or to invite it to reinterpret or rethink itself on Hegelian or non-Hegelian base. Thomism thus becomes one more diner at the neo-modernist smorgasbord. One may affirm, for example, that the celebration of the Mass is an action of Christ and of the people of God hierarchically organized. But one gives a new meaning to the term hierarchically organized, as the BAC commentators do, affirming that it does not involve higher and lower degrees of dignity. In another example furnished by the BAC commentators, one can admit that there is a real presence of Christ in the sacrament of the Eucharist, but this real presence is considered equal to the presence of Christ in the praying assembly. Okay, pause for a second. One thing I would note here, and what he's talking about there is references to previous chapters, so I'm not gonna go into all that. The thing here to recognize, though, is that Francis did this. I don't know if you remember a document. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head which document it was, where he claims to be a Thomist. He cites St. Thomas in the footnotes, but it is completely not Thomistic whatsoever. And that's a trick, because he's just mentioning him, getting lip service, saying, oh yeah, we're Thomists, we're also Thomists, and putting him and framing him as one theologian amongst many. All right, continuing. In summary, the preoccupation with disguising themselves is particularly acute among the progressivists, who know very well that the faithful would immediately repudiate them if they knew their real designs, thus affirming the traditional doctrine and then relativizing it to the point of concluding the contrary of what was just said in a characteristic tactic of progressive neo-modernism. It was one of modernism. However, in addition to being a tactic, this way of proceeding expresses a basic element of neo-modernist metaphysics, or rather it forms part of a dialectical Hegelian and numerological anti-metaphysics of the neo-modernist. Don't worry about that. Moving on. Here are some examples taken from the new theories about the indissolubility of matrimony, a point of doctrine very different from those that we have been discussing. This will show you how broadly progressivists take advantage of dialectical contradictions. Now, this part is, we're almost done here. Just 3 pages left, 2.5 pages left. And here's the thing about this part right here. Mors Laetitia, in the current teaching of the Church on divorce or remarriage, it's here. Right here, we're reading it. And this is 1969 when this book was published. And the topic being covered here comes out in 1966. So this is going on for a long time. The modernists and the progressivists have been taking small steps over a long period of time. That's the trick. And they'll do little. But here it is. In his book, Marriage in the Modern World, Father Bernard Harling, a Second Vatican Council peritus considered by the progressivists as the best moral theologian of our days, proposes surreptitiously that Catholics accept divorce. For example, referring to divorced persons who are remarried, he writes, quite often such divorced and remarried people have built up an erroneous conscience. Interesting. Erroneous conscience. Since they live together in peace and harmony, they become, day by day, more and more convinced that God blesses their union. They probably admit that divorce and remarriage should not be, but for some reason or none, they are subjectively convinced that in their case, the first marriage was invalid, and conclude that from the new union, even though it cannot be made in church, is a true marriage in the sight of God. In this connection, one must also consider the frequent insufficiency of instructions in such matters. It quite often happens that such people, without mentioning their invalid marriages, go to a church where they are not known, or where at least nothing is known about their invalid marriage, and there sincerely confess their sins and make a devout communion. Communion for the divorce and remarriage, Amoris Laetitia, anybody? There is also always the possibility that in recognition of their subjective good intentions, God will pardon them, even though, in spite of everything, their marriage remains invalid. Further, dealing with the case of youthful divorced persons who have remarried, he expresses the following ideas. Quote, even if they have not entirely succeeded in living together as brother and sister, their constant upholding of the indissolubility of marriage and their effort to save others from such a situation, associated with a genuine effort on their part, are a kind of preparation for, an anticipation of a later sacramental confession. If, after every failure, their love of God leads them to contrition, and they pray together, go to church together, and fight every inch of the way to live the Christian life, they are on the way toward the light, and perhaps, too, most of the time, in the state of grace. End quote. Already in these texts of Father Herring, several contradictions appear. It is particularly significant, however, that in one of the first paragraphs of the item in which he discusses the matter, he declares, quote, naturally the Church's principle remains firm that divorced persons who have first marriage was valid in the sight of God and their conscience have no right to remarry, and that a civil marriage is no true marriage, end quote. So notice, he says, if the first marriage is valid in the sight of God and their conscience have no right to remarry, and civil marriage is no marriage at all, yet what did we just read of everything else he just said there? He was justifying it, saying they can even present themselves for Holy Communion. They probably are even in a state of grace. That's heresy. That's very clear heresy. And that's very much what we're hearing today with Amoris Laetitia, with the answer to the dubia, with all these different things. On September 29th, 1965, the Melkite Patriarch Vicar of the See of Alexandria, Cairo, and Sudan, Bishop Elias Zogby, made a speech in the council that caused a sensation, advocating divorce in the case of a young person abandoned without any fault of his own by his spouse. Some days later, however, trying to undo the scandal caused by his previous speech, Bishop Zogby spoke again. He defended the same thesis of divorce, but also made some affirmations, apparently unequivocal, that he added to traditional doctrine about marriage, such as the following. I affirm clearly in my speech, September 29th, the immutable principle of the indissolubility of matrimony. The indissolubility of matrimony is so anchored in the tradition of the Church of the East and West, both Orthodox and Catholic, that a council speech cannot question it. The Orthodox tradition, in fact, always considered matrimony as indissoluble as a unit of Christ, the Church, his bride. So what do we see here? This bishop, this Melkite patriarch, he defends divorce and remarriage. But what does he do? He comes down and says, well, of course, the tradition has always taught that the indissolubility of marriage, of course, this is what it's taught. Oh, why could nobody could say otherwise. Well, except you could say otherwise, and you have said otherwise. He's contradicting himself, and he's fine with it. Okay, about a half a page left. About half a page left. In an article about divorce published in Revisita Ecclesiasta Brasilia in 1968, Father Eduardo Hornaret writes at the beginning, quote, Catholic thinking regarding marriage has always repeated the basic fundamental affirmation that the sacrament of matrimony is indissoluble. This affirmation is based on the legitimate interpretation of Revelation, whose most clear expression is found in the famous text of Matthew 19, verses 1 through 12, end quote. In the following pages, however, the author declares that the apostles and their successors did not exactly understand the evangelical message on the indissolubility of matrimony. He sustains that the erroneous interpretation of this message has reached its apex today. That's called abusing development of doctrine, guys. Have you heard that before? Have you heard anybody use this as an argument before? Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. He insinuates that Protestants have something in their favor in their attack on the Catholic doctrine about the sacrament of matrimony. He ends the article proposing, quote, a revision of the rigoristic discipline, end quote, on marriage since people are, quote, still incapable of living according to the evangelical requirements, end quote. Doesn't that sound familiar to you? Does that sound familiar about people not able to live according to the evangelical requirements? Have you heard that statement almost verbatim before? It sounds like something out of almost every single document from Francis. As we see, the position of Father Hornaret in this is the fruit either of real cynicism or crass error. In either case, he falls into flagrant contradiction. Let's see. All right, last paragraph, and then a footnote that's worthy of reading. Conclusion. Given what has been said, it will be understood that the existence of orthodox passages in the 1969 Institutio cannot be alleged as a sufficient reason to exempt it from censure. On the contrary, that opposing doctrines are found there side by side increases the gravity of the criticism that must be made. And then footnote here, it is necessary to establish a general principle here. When one really and sincerely wishes to dissipate the suspicions hanging over a text showing traces of neo-modernism, one should not merely put an orthodox declaration beside it. Such a measure would only aggravate the ambiguity and cause more confusion among souls. Rather, rectifying the obscure, equivocal, and heterodox passages would be absolutely indispensable. It would be absolutely necessary to undo the spurious unions between truth and error, which characterized Hegelianism, phenomenology, and neo-modernism, in addition to teaching good doctrine in its integrity. Not acting this way is to give to one's own children bread mixed with stones and fish mixed with serpents. So, that's the whole chapter. If you have any questions, comments, and concerns, I'll take them right now. So leave them in the chat below. And the last thing I'll say about that passage is simply that what he's saying at the end there is that when you have these ambiguous texts, if you actually were innocent of neo-modernism, you did not actually commit neo-modernism, you're not a modernist, you're not committing any of those sins, nothing whatsoever, then you would be obliged not to simply affirm the correct teaching and say, and put that side by side with the ambiguous or things that might have been erroneous, but you have to correct it. You have to get rid of it. Say, nope, we're going to get rid of this passage because it's confusing, it's ambiguous, it's bad. And if you simply just made a mistake, then correct it. Otherwise, you're giving your children stones instead of bread. You're giving your kids a serpent instead of fish. You are harming the faithful. People are saying that, and I mean, it's funny, the document says, if it's going to cause scandal, you can't do it. Well, I guess the whole thing can't be done because everybody's scandalized by it. Everybody who has not been scandalized by this. So, very clear to me. Very, very clear to me. All right, guys, let's see. Any comments? Monica says, hi, everyone. I'm falling asleep. Dana says, me too. I think everyone's falling asleep today. I fell asleep. Kinnick, talking about Rudy's drink. Rudy's saying he regrets it. Let's see. Okay, and no comments. Then we will close out. And I'm checking live chat. Nothing there. All right, guys. God bless you guys. Hopefully it was interesting to you. And feel free to share it with somebody that you think might need to hear it, that it might be helpful for. It's a little dense, so sorry about that. But the name of the book, if you want to get it, Two Timely Issues by Arnaldo Xavier de Silveira, published by the American TFP. So if you want to get that, I think it's in other languages too, so feel free to do that. I think the original language was Brazilian, was Portuguese, I think. It was the original language. But you can find that in several different places. Trying to see if it tells me where. Prince United States of America, Foundation for Crystallization, that's the TFP. Yeah, I don't know, just look up American TFP. If I look up the book, Two Timely Issues by Arnaldo Xavier de Silveira, you should be able to find it on Amazon. All right, God bless you guys. Let me see if I can figure out how to turn this off from my phone.